The moment the wedding cake was carried into the reception hall, nearly every guest in that room was smiling. The music was soft, the lights were warm, and the room smelled of fresh roses and champagne. Everyone was happy. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone except the bride. Her name was Natalie, and if you had been standing close enough to her that evening, you would have noticed something that nobody else seemed to catch. When the server placed a generous slice of white cake in front of her, decorated with soft ivory frosting and little sugar flowers, Natalie looked at it the way a person looks at something they know will hurt them. She did not flinch. She did not say a word. She simply folded her hands neatly in her lap, lifted her eyes toward the crowd of dancing guests, and left the cake completely untouched. Her new husband, Daniel Whitfield, noticed. He did not say anything at first. He was a man who had spent years mastering the art of not saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. But he noticed, in that small, quiet moment, a woman staring at a slice of cake like it had the power to destroy her, would eventually unravel everything Daniel thought he knew about himself, his marriage, and the life he had built on the wrong foundation. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to truly understand what happened in that reception hall, you have to understand who Natalie was before she ever walked down that aisle. She was the kind of woman people described as easy to be around, quiet, thoughtful, always the one to refill your glass before you noticed it was empty. She had grown up in a household in rural Georgia where her father, Robert, was the kind of man who commanded every room he entered. Not because he was warm or generous, but because everyone around him had learned, slowly and painfully, that his mood set the temperature for the entire house. Natalie's mother had mastered the art of invisibility years before Natalie was even born. And Natalie, watching her mother disappear, piece by piece, had done exactly the same thing. She learned to speak softly, to take up as little space as possible, to apologize for things that were not her fault, to eat whatever was put in front of her and say thank you, even when she wasn't hungry. She never made requests. She rarely made eye contact when she disagreed with something. In celebrations, birthdays, holidays, anything that was supposed to be joyful, those were the hardest days of all, because in her house, joy was always followed by something worse. There was a memory Natalie had carried for 23 years. She was 16 years old. It was her birthday. Her mother had baked a cake, white cake with pink frosting, because that was Natalie's favorite. Her father had come home in one of his moods that evening, and when he saw the cake on the table, he didn't ask what it was for. He picked it up, and he placed it in the trash, right in front of her mother, in front of her younger brother, Thomas, who was only 9 and didn't understand why his sister suddenly stopped crying and went completely still. Her father said, "We don't celebrate mediocrity in this house." Then he walked upstairs. Natalie never had a birthday cake again after that. And 23 years later, standing in the most expensive dress she had ever worn, in a reception hall full of people who were clapping and laughing and raising their glasses, she could not bring herself to touch the slice of white cake sitting in front of her, because somewhere deep in her body, celebration still felt like a warning. Can you imagine carrying something like that for over 2 decades and never telling a single soul? Think about that for a moment. How many people do you know who are smiling on the outside and carrying something quietly devastating on the inside? How many times have you done it yourself? Now, Daniel, he was not a bad man. That is the part of this story that makes it complicated, and complicated is what makes it real. Daniel was 38 years old when he married Natalie. He was successful. He ran a mid-sized construction firm in Nashville with his older brother. And he was the kind of man who prided himself on being dependable. He was the guy who showed up when it mattered. He fixed things. He was practical and organized and emotionally steady in the way that people often are when they have never had to sit with someone else's pain long enough to feel it themselves. He and Natalie had dated for 14 months before he proposed. She was calm, he thought. Low maintenance. She never demanded much, never caused scenes, never asked him to rearrange his life for her. What Daniel did not understand, what he would not understand for a long time, was that a woman who never asks for anything is not low maintenance. She is a woman who has been taught that her needs do not matter. And then there was Kristen. She had been in Daniel's life for almost 2 years before the wedding. She was his project manager, sharp and confident, and always the most articulate person in any room. Their relationship had crossed a line about 8 months before Daniel proposed to Natalie, and Daniel, rather than end things cleanly, had convinced himself that once he was married, it would simply resolve itself. That was the lie he was living on the day he stood at the altar and watched Natalie walk toward him in white silk, her eyes calm, her hands still, her face holding that expression he could never quite read. 3 months into the marriage, very little had changed on the surface. Natalie cooked, she cleaned, she asked Daniel how his day went and listened without interrupting. She arranged flowers on the dining table on Sunday mornings. She ironed his shirts when he forgot to take them to the cleaners. She said, "I'm sorry," for things she had absolutely no reason to apologize for. Traffic making her 10 minutes late, running out of coffee creamer, accidentally leaving the television on too long. And Daniel, busy, distracted, still texting Kristen from his second phone he kept in his desk drawer, barely registered any of it. Until the evening, he came home early from work and found Natalie sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark. She had not turned a single light on. She was just sitting there, hands folded, staring at nothing. He asked her what was wrong. She said, "Nothing. I'm sorry. I was just thinking." He turned the light on, told her not to sit in the dark, and went upstairs to return Kristen's call. He was almost to the top of the stairs when something made him stop. He stood there with one hand on the railing, and for the first time in months, he actually thought about what he had just seen. His wife sitting alone in the dark, apologizing for thinking. Something cold moved through him. He could not name it yet, but he did not make the call to Kristen that night. The turning point came 6 weeks later at a dinner party hosted by his colleague Jim and his wife. Natalie had worn a simple navy dress, and she had been quiet all evening, which was not unusual. But at one point during dinner, Jim's wife Patricia made a joke, something lighthearted about how Natalie always looked so composed, and Natalie smiled politely and said, "I just try not to take up too much space." The table laughed. Natalie laughed too. But Daniel looked at his wife's face in the moment, right after the laughter faded, and he saw something there that he recognized, though he could not explain why. It was the look of someone who had just accidentally told the truth. He thought about it the entire drive home. He thought about it the next morning over coffee. He thought about it in the shower and on his commute and sitting in a meeting where someone was talking about quarterly projections, and he heard absolutely none of it. His wife was trying not to take up too much space in her own marriage, in her own life. That night, he asked her to sit with him after dinner, not to watch television, not to go over a grocery list. He asked her to just sit with him at the kitchen table, and he looked at her, and he said, "Tell me something real, Natalie. Tell me something you have never said out loud." She looked at him for a long time. You could see her deciding. And then, very quietly, she told him about the birthday cake. She told him about her father, about Thomas watching with wide eyes from across the table, about the way she had stood there and not cried, because she had already learned by 16 that crying made things worse, about every cake she had avoided since then, every celebration that made her chest tighten, every moment of joy that her nervous system immediately associated with the moment before something was taken away. She told him all of it in a voice that barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator. And when she was done, she looked at her hands and said, "I know it sounds small." Daniel could not speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it cracked. He said, "It is not small. Natalie, none of that is small." He sat with that conversation for 3 days. He replayed it. He thought about the untouched cake at their wedding reception. He thought about her apologizing in the dark. He thought about 14 months of dating a woman who never once told him what she actually needed, because she had never been taught that she was allowed to. And then he thought about Kristen. He thought about what he was doing, who he was being, and he realized that he had been so focused on what he was missing in his life that he had never once stopped to ask what his wife was carrying in hers. He had chosen comfort over clarity, distraction over presence, and a woman sitting across from him at that kitchen table, the woman who folded her hands in her lap and said, "I'm sorry for existing." She deserved someone who actually showed up. If you were in Daniel's place that night, what would you have done? Could you have walked away from the life you had been hiding in for a woman who had never once asked you to? He wrote Kristen a message that Thursday evening. He did not make excuses. He did not leave room for a conversation. He said, "This is over. Do not contact me again. I am choosing my wife. I should have made that choice a long time ago." Then he put the phone in his desk drawer, walked downstairs, and sat back down at the kitchen table where Natalie was eating toast alone because she had not wanted to interrupt his evening. The healing was not instant. It never is. But Daniel began to show up in small, deliberate ways that Natalie had never experienced before. He started asking what she wanted for dinner, and then making it. He stopped working late on Fridays. He turned the lights on when he got home, so the house was never dark when she walked into her room. He did not tell her the affair was over right away. That conversation came 6 weeks later, and it was long and honest and painful and necessary. But he told her, and she listened, and she cried for the first time in his presence in a way that was not quiet and controlled, but real and raw and finally, mercifully allowed. On the evening of their one-year wedding anniversary, Natalie sat down to a dinner Daniel had cooked himself, imperfectly, and with smoke rising from the oven at one point, and with a nervous energy that made her smile more than she had in months. And at the end of the meal, he brought out a small white cake. No grand gesture, no audience, just the two of them and a single candle and the soft sound of rain against the window. She looked at it for a long moment. He said, simply, "You do not have to." And then, after a pause that held 23 years of silence, she picked up the fork and she took a bite. Because she wanted to. Because for the first time in her adult life, she was sitting at a table where her presence was not just tolerated. It was chosen. Some wounds are so quiet that the world mistakes them for peace. Some people spend entire lifetimes becoming smaller and smaller, and no one notices because they do it so gracefully. If this story reached something in you today, if you thought of someone you love or yourself, leave a comment below. Tell us what moment in this story moved you the most. And tell us, honestly, do you think Natalie was right to forgive him? Would you have? We want to hear from you.